orient us that in the same way that the Christian church has had all of these breakaway movements and kind of reforming movements, we can think of, in a lot of ways, Buddhism as one of these religious traditions that starts out as a kind of almost a Protestant movement, but that becomes so distinct in its teachings that it breaks away and really becomes its own religion. All right, so 2,500 years ago, I'm going to switch over to the slides now. I just wanted to orient us where we were at in the broad history of Hinduism. And then, 2,500 years ago, there were a lot of people who were reacting to the kind of elitism that had been developing in Hinduism. There was the Vedic form of religion that was really only practiced by a few people, by religious elites. These were the people who knew Sanskrit, and only a very few people could come in and formally participate in the elaborate fire rituals that were occurring 2,500 years ago in Vedic Hinduism. And in the same way that Protestants and others start to react to the kind of religious elitism in the papacy and in the Latin church, the same way that the Protestant Reformation launches a kind of local religion in local languages. Luther translates the Bible into German, and this launches all of these movements to try to make it so that people can access God themselves with kind of your own, you can read the text and you can practice your own form of religion. This is part of what was happening 2,500 years ago. There were a couple of main religions that sort of broke away. A guy named Mahavira, he started a religion that became known as Jainism. And this was an effort by these communities that were outside of the city centers where these religious elites were practicing Vedic religion. In the forests, there were people who were practicing new forms of asceticism and kind of practices of meditation and self-denial. They were practicing forms of religion that they themselves could practice. We don't need your fire ritual, you religious elites. We don't need the caste system that had been developing up to that point. The caste system meant that only a very few at the top, the princes and the priests, and then a few kind of middle class merchants and stuff, only they could approach the sacred fire rituals. So that left most of the low caste and outcast people, they were out in the cold. And what started happening 2,500 years ago is an effort to rethink the forms of religion, a kind of democratizing of religion in a lot of ways, very similar to the Protestant Reformation in a lot of ways. We have another guy named Siddhartha Gautama. That's the kind of family name of the person who becomes known as the Buddha. And you can see his years there. He was about 2,500 years ago. What I would say is that he was born into the elite groups of Vedic society. He was what is called a Kshatriya, which is a prince. He was a high class person born into a kingdom. As a Hindu prince, there was early on a kind of legend. A person came along and told his father that this man, this son that he is about to have, that he will either have one of two paths in life. Either he will become a great king and he will assume the kind of kingdom of his father, or he will renounce all of it and he will leave and become a wandering ascetic out in the forest. And his father was very distressed about the second part of this kind of prophecy. And so what he does with the young Siddhartha is that he essentially removes all form of suffering from the view of his young son. So anybody who is aging, sorry, older folks, but the king then said that anybody who is aging should not see this. He should only see young, beautiful people. Anybody who is diseased, if you had COVID, you would be.
Oh, looks like we lost him.
Yeah.
I don't think his boys are with him, so I don't know what happened to his internet.
Can't blame his sons.
No. No, I know that he's quarantining right now, so. But I can kind of continue the story a little bit. I don't know it in depth as in depth as Eric does, but the idea, of course, is that Siddhartha is basically lives the sheltered, protected life, and then one day takes a trip outside of the palace and sees suffering and death. Oh, there you are.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, my connection I thought was pretty good, but now I've reconnected it. I think I had a loose connection.
I got Siddhartha out of the palace.
Okay, you got him out of the palace.
He's out of the palace. He's out visiting the nursing homes.
Okay, that's exactly what happens. So the young Siddhartha starts to wonder. Oh boy, we're getting the feedback again.
Here, just wait. I can fix that. There.
Yeah.
Did that help?
I think so. I don't hear the feedback on my end.
We don't either.
Yep, go for it.
Okay. All right. So that's exactly what happens, what Pastor Eric said. The young Siddhartha realizes that there's more to the world, and he goes outside of the palace walls, and sure enough, he sees an old person. He sees a diseased person. He sees a corpse, and then he also sees an ascetic monk. At that moment, he vows to find an answer to these things that had so shocked him. He realizes that there is chaos in the world. He realizes that there is suffering in the world. And why was it that just by birth, he was given the means not to experience suffering, but so many people in life have? And so he vows to go and try to find an answer to this. At this point, we can say that the young Siddhartha probably goes toward that second path that prophecy had foretold. And he goes off into the forests, into these communities of people who were practicing very austere practices. They were severe renouncers. They would try to live on just a grain of rice a day and all kinds of things. Essentially what happens is that he launches into these meditative practices and these practices of self-denial, and he becomes very successful at it. At one point, he sits down under a tree and he vows not to move until he has an answer to all of the suffering in the world. And, you know, the accounts go in all sorts of different legendary directions. He's tempted by all of these cosmic demons. One is called Mara. He sits with utter stillness, and he has this sort of grand insight. And it's a path that he calls the middle path. And essentially, it's the path of a kind of leading a life of selflessness. That is going to be one of the great ways that everyone, if they were to practice this sort of insight, could lead to a world where suffering is greatly reduced and where we move into a life instead filled by compassion and living toward others, and that we can greatly reduce the suffering in the world. That Bodhi tree, it's called, the tree of enlightenment. You can see there in my slide. I'm there. If you see the picture, I'm there under that Bodhi tree, and with one of my friends, we led a group of 20 students from Roanoke College, and we spent some time at the place where he became enlightened under that tree. There's a temple there just to the right. At the bottom, what that represents, that kind of dome-shaped structure, once he becomes enlightened, he takes a vow then to bring this teaching out to the world. And his very first sermon is at this place where that dome is. It's called Sarnath. And he gives what becomes the core of Buddhist teachings, that everyone, you religious elites, everyone can experience enlightenment, and it's through 4 basic truths of life. And so here is kind of the core of Buddhist teachings. These are basic facts of existence. The first fact, this is not unlike, like Alcoholics Anonymous and other recovery movements like that, who say the very first or the most important step for recovering from alcohol or drugs or whatever it may be is to admit that you have a problem, right? That very first step. What the Buddha essentially does is to say the very first thing that we have to admit is that in our existence, no matter what we do, we live in a world where suffering is a part of it. And the word there in Sanskrit is called dukkha. And the word basically means this, that everything that we do, we take a breath, we put on a piece of clothing, we go and eat a meal, move about in the world in our cars, whatever it may be, we build a house. Everything that we do is essentially at the cost of other beings. Does that make sense? Like that shirt that you're wearing had to come from somewhere. Someone had to grow that the plants for the cotton. It had to be brought in as a crop. It had to be dyed. Machines had to be made to spin it out and to weave it and then to cut it. And, then it was probably made in Bangladesh or someplace. There had to be an aircraft that brought it to the United States, et cetera, et cetera. A lot into just creating your shirt or then your home or whatever it may be. The point is, every act that we have, every desire that we have for things around us come at a cost to a great many other things, the Buddha says. All right, so then that brings us to the second point. Everything is kind of contingent in life, and there is a cost for everything. The origin of that cost, or that what he calls dukkha or suffering, the origin of that contingent cost is a desire for things, right? So remember at this point that the Buddha had renounced a very lavish life as a prince. And he goes to these forest communities and he sits down and he tries practicing a life of utter simplicity. He didn't need elaborate pillows and beds and palaces and, the best food coming from the farthest reaches and all of that kind of thing. Instead, he starts practicing a form of practice where you try to undo those selfish desires. You try to become desireless, all right? I've called it a kind of dispassionate compassion, something like that, where what you try to do essentially is to draw down all of your desires and need for things, right? To try to minimize that as much as possible. And that's the third noble truth, which is that desire can be brought down in the way that we affect all living beings and all of the universe and that kind of thing. And how do we do it? We do it by trying to minimize our sense of self. All right. So what I mean by that is we live in a culture that almost glorifies you need the latest Lexus. You need the latest electronics. You need, to travel the world and to go to exotic places. You deserve it, right?
You do not.
Deserve it.
You can't
What's
have
that?
people. You can't have people infringe upon your personal liberties and make you wear a mask.
Well, that's a part of it as well. We get just indignant, right? We have a very strong sense of self, I think, in American Western culture, right? That we have the Marlboro Man, that sense of rugged individualism, and and then we have our kind of materialistic lifestyle and that sort of thing. The Buddha is coming along and saying, every choice that you make that way is causing a ripple effect in the big pond. And everybody else then all of a sudden they're experiencing the cost of your choices, right? I think it is kind of related to what we were talking about with wearing masks and all of that earlier. What he says is this: the best way for suffering to be overcome in the world is what is known as nirvana. And this is not a 90s grunge band from Seattle. Nirvana means this. So imagine that, I have a flame in front of me. If you can see me on the camera there, I have a candle in front of me. Nirvana means this. It means to blow something out. It means to empty or do away with it, right? So the flame of desire, which can quickly grow into these wildfires, the flame of desire can be blown out. And how do we do it? By less and less emphasis on ourself, where we then become selfish, and instead we blow out our sense of self. The Buddha, one of the things that he does is he says the self is actually at its core really an ephemeral, illusory kind of concept. We like to think of ourselves as absolute things, right? But instead, the self, the Buddha would teach, the self is more like a kind of flowing river. It's more like a flame that is passed from one candle to the next, to the next, to the next. The self is not anything static, right? Think about it. When we're born, when we're in college, when we're middle-aged, when we retire, and then, when we're heading toward old age, what is the self in the midst of that? Our self is always changing and becoming something else. So in this way of thinking, the self is not so much a noun that we need to focus on and feed it constantly, but instead the self is much more a kind of verb. It's a series of happenings. And the more that we can realize the ephemeral nature of the self, the more we become selfless, right? If that makes sense. The more that we can draw down our desires to hold on to this static, existence of ourselves. Think about how much we spend on plastic surgery and cosmetics and all of this to try to arrest our sense of who we are, right? We want to freeze it in time. But the Buddha says, no, embrace that you are a self that is intimately interrelated with all things around you. And what will start to happen is that you begin to lead a selfless life that is for the sake of others. And all of a sudden now compassion replaces suffering. And so he says there is a basic path for doing that. You do 8 things. This becomes known as the Noble Eightfold Path. And it's sort of defined by way of certain disciplines, certain mental exercises. We develop our understanding, and then explicit ways that we can lead lives of compassion. He basically says this: we should have right understanding. We should understand the ways that ourselves are at its core sort of slippery and non-static. And then in light of that, we can start to act in selfless ways. That should give rise to right thought or right motives. All of a sudden now we're not focused on ourselves and selfishness, but we start to lead lives for the sake of others. So our thought and our motives change. Speech matters, the Buddha says. This is a lesson for today's America, right? Words matter. And be aware that every single word that comes out of your mouth, does it bend towards suffering and causing ill and harm for others? Or does it bend toward selflessness and compassion? Actions matter. Same question. Everything that you do you need that 21st shirt when you already have 20? Or do you need that fourth car when you already have 3? Or you understand, right? Every single action is creating a world that is contingently locked in, sort of mutual feeding upon one another. So the Buddha says, be aware, even the smallest action can have tremendous consequences, either bent towards suffering or bent toward compassion. So right livelihood as well. Do you make your daily living in a way that uplifts others, that tries to ease the suffering of others, that creates a world of compassion, or not? Right effort as well. Every day, seek to bend toward the good and away from the suffering that we all cause one another. That, of course, is encapsulated in right mindfulness. Be aware. I mean, we're not always in control of our minds. Our minds sometimes gain control of us, but try to come back to that. That's what meditation is. Meditation is an effort to calm the muddy waters. And when water sits for a while in stillness, what happens with that muddy water? It becomes clear, right? The precipitates go down to the bottom and the water becomes clear. That's what our minds can be if we practice regular meditation and then practice these insights and living toward one another. I know our time is almost up here. I'll just say this quickly, and then maybe we can spend time on some questions. This is my last slide. You might ask this question: is Buddhism a philosophy or is it a religion?
Yeah.
The answer is both.
Yeah.
Yes. There is a Southern school called the Theravada school, and they really focus on kind of the philosophical doctrines, this idea of the emptiness of the self and, rethinking the Hindu ideas of dharma, our duty, and rethinking the way that karma acts in the world and propagates out and creates suffering for all. So lead a life of meditative compassion. Don't go into a temple and worship or that kind of thing if you can find enlightenment within yourself, the Theravada text might say, right? But there is another school of Buddhism, and this is there in Tibet and in China and in Japan. It's called the Mahayana school, a great vehicle. And they have this idea that there wasn't just one historic Buddha who was this great sage, but instead they hold that there are many Buddhas. And in fact, there are always these enlightened beings in our world that are kind of sent from the cosmos, what is part of what is known as the 3 Buddha bodies. These cosmic Buddhist principles become embodied in these enlightened beings known as bodhisattvas. A bodhisattva is someone who could break out of the cycle of rebirth, but who comes back into the world to help the world at its time of most distress. The Dalai Lama, you can see the picture there of him. The Dalai Lama is viewed to be an almost divine being, an incarnation of this cosmic Buddhahood, and we all have it within ourselves. It's just a matter of being taught by other enlightened beings to cultivate this within ourselves. and to practice our own sort of insight meditation. There are all kinds of stories told about many Buddhas in the world. And find a teacher, find someone who embodies this great cosmic principle of Buddhahood. And there are these stories called the Jataka tales that tell the story of all of these different Buddhas who live in all sorts of different times. This is full-on religion. And so there you will have in Tibet and China and Japan, you'll have temples and pagodas and other places where you can see the lower right of that slide. The Buddha is worshipped as a divine being. And there are all sorts of heavens and hells and all kinds of things in Mahayana Buddhism. So in a nutshell, that's Buddhism. I think we did it in about 15 or 20 minutes, maybe, with our late start and then our interruption. But that is Buddhism there. I would be very interested in any kind of questions that you have.
Is Confucianism, is that anywhere related to Buddhism? Confucian?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mentioned that in the one slide. I can kind of put it up here. I mentioned that 2,500 years ago, something was in the water in Asia. There were all sorts of people who were breaking away and finding new forms or paths of philosophy, of religion. We have Mahavira there and Siddhartha Gautama. Around that same time, 2,500 years ago, there were two other sages in China. One was known as Confucius, and then another one, his name is Lao Tzu. And they form what become known as the two great traditions of Chinese philosophy and religion, namely Confucianism, and then what is known as Taoism, that yin and yang sort of teaching about Taoism. Those started out as separate, completely separate traditions. Confucius and Lao Tzu were contemporaries of the Buddha. The Buddha was in India, and Confucius and Lao Tzu were over in China. What happened within a few centuries after all three of them pass away is that Buddhism leaves India and it comes into China. And in those generations that follow after Confucius and the Buddha, there is a great mixing between Buddhist teachings and Confucian teachings, and even then Taoist teachings. And today you will see, even though communism, supposedly kind of did away with religion in modern China, it never really went away. Those three great traditions are still very much active and very much blended in the lives of most people in China. And I know we have a person maybe still here in the group who recently came back from China. I'd be interested to hear kind of his take maybe on what I was just saying.
One, Diane.
Did I gather that
Not you, Diane.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Dennis is right here with me, so I'll let him talk.
Yeah. So Diane and I have both made many trips to China over about the last 9 years. Our daughter-in-law is Chinese, grew up in China and has been sheltering with us for the last 8 months. But yeah, we've really enjoyed our travels in China. And when you go, there's several really great mountain peaks that are open to the public, and they kind of become like pilgrimage sites. You'll see many people, even many very old people, walking up these incredible long stairways up to the tops of these summits. And there'll typically be several different kinds of temples. I think maybe the three that you mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised if some of them have 4 different religious sites.
Even Shinto, there would be a lot of Shinto temples as well, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And some hills are specific to certain, like Paul would hike something and say, well, this one was a Taoist mountain. So sometimes they specialize a little bit, but yeah, you're certainly surrounded by all these faiths. And we've always felt, I love going into the temples and I just act like I'm Buddhist, I like incense and, it's fine. And the people who are like the temple attendants will show you the proper way to do a prayer. They want you to participate. You're included whether or not you know the first thing about whatever faith that temple is for. So yeah, that's been fun.
Yeah, I know in the West, we can say in Europe and America, there have been a number of even formal movements that have talked about the great compatibility between being a Christian and also following various forms of Buddhist meditation and this kind of thing. Even sometimes blending like Christian centering prayer and Buddhist pranayama, it's called, which is kind of Buddhist breath awareness. There are a lot of movements where you have, a lot of people, what it comes down to is that a lot of people can function perfectly well as a Buddhist Christian, that kind of thing. And that you can be both at the same time. And at least, like the question was earlier about China, the way that most of the world functions in India, that's much more my area. You will have Hindus and you'll have Muslims and you'll have some Buddhists and Christians and others. But the way that it's practiced by most people on the ground is that you flow in between all of these religious traditions. It depends what's happening in your family or in your life. I know in China, for example, it's not uncommon if someone dies in the family, you may have been practicing, worship or something at a local Taoist temple or following the teachings of Confucius Analects in maybe your schooling or whatever it may be. But if someone dies in a family in China or I've been to Vietnam and I know that this is common there, you will call a Buddhist, right? You would call a Buddhist monk because Buddhism is that tradition that we didn't really get into this, but Buddhism focuses a lot on the nature of life and death and on bodily functions. There are even Buddhist meditations that ask you to think about your phlegm, your, all the fluids. You're supposed to think and meditate on the fluid nature of ourselves by thinking about ourselves as kind of liquid beings. And then someone, we are ultimately meant to die and then to lead a life where we have death front and immediate to us. There are a lot of Buddhist texts that talk about meditating on a corpse, for example. So if someone dies in Asia, oftentimes they will call a Buddhist monk. And this kind of fluidity between religions is really the way that most people function in the world. So if you're a person who follows Confucius, it would be perfectly compatible with a kind of going into, a mountain hike. There are all of these great texts that talk about these sages who go on these long mountain journeys and they come to all of these different, temples and so forth. I have a book that I'm using in my religion class right now by a guy named Ba Shou, where it's called The Narrow Road to the Deep North. And in that text, he talks about how he goes on these mountain treks to seek enlightenment. And he goes into Shinto temples and Buddhist meditation halls and all of these different places. And from that perspective, you're not checking a box. You're either Buddhist or you're Confucian. There is great fluidity between how all of this is lived out.
Yeah, one of the things that has struck me from early on in our trips to China, how much attention is given to one's ancestors, parents, grandparents, and other ancestors are just so highly revered. And I suppose that was tied to their Buddhist tradition. But I had a chance to visit some churches in China, and especially in Hong Kong. Yeah, Christian churches, and especially in Hong Kong, I got to spend a few weekends in Hong Kong where they actually have, there's an evangelical Lutheran Church of Hong Kong with over 50 separate congregations. And I got to attend services at, I guess, a couple of those. And even there, it seemed like a lot more attention given to kind of recognizing what we owe to our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents.
So more cultural.
Yeah.
I've always felt to go into the temples and things, it gives you such a feeling of holiness. And the reason I started like lighting a candle or lighting the incense is because I really felt like God is right there. And it just, I can understand how Chinese people will feel freely able to move between all of them, because you certainly get this feeling of reverence and a connection with God in all of them.
Yeah, I tell you, just personally, I went to Luther Seminary with Pastor Eric and, all of that. I was not raised Lutheran, but I came into Lutheranism by way of having practiced Tibetan Buddhism for a while as late in high school and in my undergrad years in northern Colorado. There's a very active kind of Tibetan Buddhist population, that kind of thing. So Asia has always sort of been there for me. When I've come full circle on a lot of it, right? I was married to a Lutheran pastor, and then, my kids are certainly being raised Lutheran. But I tell you, Diane, a lot of what you were saying, I have felt is true for me. I have learned more about my own Christianity and my own Lutheranism by going into Hindu temples, by going into mosques, by, spending time with my Buddhist friends, my Hindu friends, my Muslim friends. I've learned more about my own traditions by having experienced these other religious traditions than I ever would have imagined would be possible. It's a pretty fantastic thing when you look at your own religious tradition through the eyes of another. You really learn a lot.
So I've heard it said that Galilee, the city where Jesus grew up, was at kind of a crossroads, and so I've been wondering, as you've been talking about Buddhism, might there have been some influence on Jesus from Buddhism, or is that just too far removed from Jewish culture?
So that's a great question, and there's actually been some considerable thought about that. We see a lot of overlaps. Maybe Buddhism and Christianity have a lot in common in certain ways. The idea of leading a life of sort of nonviolence, turning the other cheek, and a concern and care for the neighbor, loving the neighbor as yourself. The golden rule is very strong in both religious traditions. The idea of the self. At one point in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, "Leave the self behind. Pick up the cross and follow me," right? Leave the self behind. The Buddhists would very much hear this language and hear great affinity with their own religious traditions. It is true what you were saying, and we sort of started those 5 weeks ago talking about the ancient Near East, and we were talking about Judaism, and we talked about the place where Jesus was born as being a kind of crossroads of the world. Probably some of the teachings of Buddhism 500 years on from the time of the Buddha, probably some of those teachings would have been known in certain areas around Galilee, or certainly Jerusalem, or places like that. It goes even further, though. There are even some books that have been written that talk about, there's an author named Elizabeth Clare Prophet, for example, who writes about how in the story of Jesus, we have the narrative up to about age 12, right? And then the scriptures say he then grew in wisdom and stature, right? And that at age 30, then Jesus reappears on the scene, and then we have until age 33 when he's crucified. So we have up to age 12. He then grows in wisdom and stature, and we have those missing years from 12 to 30. Some have speculated that perhaps Jesus went to South Asia and maybe studied Buddhism. There are books written on that. I have them on my bookshelf, The Lost Years of Jesus. And the thought is that, there are certain texts in South Asia that mention a figure named Isa, which would have been a common way of saying Jesus' name back then. It's probably not based on, superior scholarship, but the theories are there. The theories are there. The thought is there. At the very least, we can say that if we sit down across the table from a Buddhist, we would have a great affinity between our religious traditions and, a lot of the teachings, for sure.
What is definitely true is that the Israelites who were in exile in Babylon, with a pretty good degree of certainty, brought back other religious traditions and incorporated them into Judaism. So, and we call that syncretism. When you kind of put these religious things together, there's definitely kind of an early Old Testament Judaism, and then there's a later Old Testament Judaism, which we find in the New Testament. You know how the Sadducees and the Pharisees disagree about the resurrection? I don't know if you guys have caught how one group believes in a resurrection, one group does not believe in a resurrection. That's kind of part of that. And the timeline is such that there could have been some Buddhist teachings that came back with the exile. The big, I would say, I don't know if you call it a dirty secret, but the big secret is that Zoroastrianism probably plays a much larger role in both Judaism and Christianity than anyone knows or is willing to admit. I mean, angels are probably more Zoroastrian than they are Jewish. Type thing.
Even the teachings of the word Satan that we would have, it actually comes from an ancient Avestan word, shaitan, which is related to an ancient Sanskrit teaching about an adversarial opponent. And maybe the idea of the devil or Satan probably comes across from Zoroastrianism and then a range of other ways also. I have a whole slideshow for that. If anybody wants that, we can
maybe have Eric come back and do Zoroastrianism, because it's fascinating, but it's definitely like, this is kind of fun. It's like, oh, that's kind of cool to think about how how Christianity and Buddhism are similar. But when you start hearing the Zoroastrian stuff, it feels like you're watching a conspiracy theory show. It really does.
Yeah, it's true. It really does. Yeah, it's compelling though. No doubt, it's compelling.
Is Alexander the Great? He had an army that went into, I believe he got as far as India, northern India, and didn't he bring a lot back of that culture back to the Mediterranean community?
Yeah, absolutely right. So not only was Alexander did make it to the doorstep of India, he made it to the area that is known as Sindh. It's modern day kind of Punjab, and then modern day Pakistan, right up around the Indus Valley area that we were talking about, in terms of the origin of Hinduism. He came right up to the doorstep of India and undoubtedly brought some of those teachings back to the Mediterranean. There are thought to have been, like, for example, in the ancient Near East, even in the time of Abraham, which would have been about 1800 BCE, there's a group there just north of Babylon called the Mitanni culture. And it's thought that the Mitanni culture, in the structure of their mythology, is very similar to Hindu mythology, ancient Vedic mythology specifically. If we have fruitful interchanges going all the way back to 1800 BCE, and by the time we get to Alexander, there were undoubtedly certain very specific, very specific teachings that were brought back. One of the interesting things too was that went in the other direction as well. So we see in Buddhist iconography, we see in a lot of the Buddhas of that particular area, the area known as Sindh, and in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, those modern countries, we see about 2,000-year-old Buddhas. The way that they looked were distinctly Mediterranean. Like if you go and you start looking at 2,000-year-old Buddhas from this area of the world, you can definitely see Greco-Roman influence on the way that they were carving their Buddhas. It's unmistakable. Like if you saw it, you would be very clear that this is Greek in its origin. And, you know, we see in that kind of iconography, we definitely know that there was exchange, you know, probably with Alexander himself, 2,300 years ago, but then also in the time after that, the kind of exchange between Buddhist cultures and, you know, Greco-Roman cultures. There's undoubtedly influence going in both directions.
Very good.
Can you say a little bit more about the current state of Buddhism? So how many Theravadan Buddhists, how many Mahayana Buddhists, where primarily do we find them?
Absolutely. So in the world today, we can say probably about 500 million Buddhists, maybe something like that. It's difficult to tell because, you know, as we were just hearing in China, the way that religion is measured is very, you know, it's very nebulous and difficult. Under some of the, you know, the communist regimes, there was a specific effort not to count religious affiliation, right? And so for many, you know, decades, the official numbers of Buddhists in China has been, you know, counted at a few million, you know, something like that, which is ridiculous. You know, in a country the size of, you know, 1.5 billion people, the number of people practicing some form of Buddhism there is much, much larger than that. So how many Buddhists are there in the world? Good question. I mean, you know, north of 500 million, the vast majority would belong to Mahayana Buddhism, and that would be Northern Buddhism. So that would be Tibet. Tibet, though, in the 1940s, were kind of overtaken by Chinese forces, and the Dalai Lama had to flee in the 1950s. Then we get kind of the Tibetan state in exile. And in northern India, there's a place called Dharamsala, and that's where the Tibetan communities live and exist. Many Tibetans came to the United States, and that launched the, among other things, that community in northern Colorado of Tibetan Buddhists, where I first started practicing some forms of Buddhist meditation. But also in California and other places, you find some some Mahayana Tibetan Buddhists practicing. And, you know, then the rest of China into Vietnam and on into Japan, all of that would be Mahayana Buddhism. In the so-called Southern schools, Theravada Buddhism, which would be the minority, maybe 20% of all Buddhists are Theravada Buddhists. That's in especially Sri Lanka, South India to some degree. Ironically, Buddhism was born in India, but it exists now in very small numbers. Very small numbers. Significant numbers in Sri Lanka, though, just off the southeast coast of India, and then on into Thailand and a few places in Southeast Asia. That's where you would find Theravada Buddhism. Now, the way that it has come to the West, into Europe and America, it's been a very mixed sort of set of communities. Some Theravada traditions have found their way into either academia or specific, maybe Thai communities or Sri Lankan communities. There, the emphasis, you know, if you ask that person, what is Buddhism today? Well, it's a great philosophy about this sage, Siddhartha Gautama. But if you go, you know, to the next town over, you might find some people from Tibet or from China or whatever it may be, and then there would be fully functioning kind of Buddhist temples.
So
Yeah.
if we find a Buddhist temple in America, especially like there's a couple in Minneapolis, they're probably Theravadan, is what you're saying.
It would depend. I mean,
Okay.
the majority here in America would be still Mahayana Buddhists, right?
Okay.
Would be some remnant of either the displaced Tibetan peoples, or maybe people from China, or from Vietnam, that kind of thing. There are certainly some Sri Lankan Theravada, meditation halls, that kind of thing. But like I can tell you that in northern Colorado, right where these wildfires are that are currently there, I'm very concerned about it. My heart is a little heavy today because this area where I grew up in northern Colorado is just in the midst of this conflagration. These horrible fires are there. And right in the middle of all that, just to the north of it, in a place called Red Feather Lakes, is this very large kind of what is called a stupa. It's a kind of meditation hall temple. It's meant to be kind of in the shape of this Buddha. It's this huge towering sort of structure, and it was built. I was there when they were building it, and even involved a very little bit in some of its construction. It was built to last for 1,000 years. When you look at that, you might think it's just a kind of meditation hall, but this is very much this is an earthly sort of manifestation of this particular Buddhist teacher named Shogam Trungpa Rinpoche. And it is thoroughly a kind of temple in every sense of the way as well. So most that you would see in America would be temples, would be more like that, where you can go in and you would light some incense, you would give some offering to the Buddha who was there, and that particular Buddha is thought to be, one of many incarnations of this divine Buddhahood. But I've taken students to, various Buddhist meditation halls. There's a large one in St. Pete, Florida, where I used to go, and they were very clear that they were Theravada Buddhists and that the Buddha was just a great sage. And when you go into that place, you're not to worship the Buddha, you're just there to kind of meditate on his philosophical teachings.
Yeah, that's the place I'm thinking of in the Twin Cities.
Right.
It's a center.
There are both.
They call them. I think that's the distinction. Maybe it's a Diamond Way Buddhist center, quote unquote, or whatever.
Well, if it's Diamond Way,
Isn't that Theravada?
No, Diamond Way
is Mahayana.
That's actually Tibetan. So that's a path called Vajrayana. So you have Theravada, you have Mahayana, and then you have specifically in Tibet, there are 4 main branches of Tibetan Buddhism, and they all fall under this umbrella called the Diamond Path or the Diamond Way, Vajrayana, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's very much a kind of Mahayana Buddhist teaching.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
No,
Sorry to correct you, Eric.
No, that's fine. It was definitely not a place of worship, though.
Well, yeah, I bet at times it is. It depends on when the festivals are and that kind of thing. But here's the thing: even in Tibetan Buddhism, the particular path of Tibetan Buddhism that I sort of followed for a little while by this teacher named Shogam Trungpa Rinpoche. It was a path called Shambhala. And there the focus was not on going in and worshiping Buddhas and all of that kind of thing. The deeply philosophical kind of set of traditions and, very much focused on the mind and mental cultivation and bodily awareness and all kinds of things. It was very much centered on that, even though this was quite certainly out of one of those 4 main branches of Tibetan Buddhism.
Now that explains it.
Yeah.
Because that sounds like Theravadan Buddhism because it's very philosophical, but yep, it's out of that branch. Okay.
Right.
Well, we're at 11:34. Thank you all for your time and interest. I will next Sunday we have Tyler Botnan here to talk about energy efficiency. I'll send out some information about that. He emailed me yesterday. And then we'll probably try to bring Eric back to talk about Zoroastrianism if you're interested in that.
Yeah, we can do it.
We'll do that well after the election so we don't, get confused with any conspiracy theories. Because trust me, when you hear all the Zoroastrianism stuff, you're going to be sitting there going, "What the heck?" So,
Yeah. Yeah. I'll try to provide evidence. How about that?
yeah, no, it's. I mean, like you'll even be like, yeah, it'll be a lot of stuff. So, yeah, it'll make you go, "Wait a second, is that Christian or is that Zoroastrian?"
Right. Right. Absolutely.
So, but thank you, Eric, and
Thank you.
we'll definitely be praying for Colorado. Eric sent me some text yesterday showing me how big that fire was. It's huge, so it's pretty.
Yeah.
Scary.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
And it's
if
not.
we could all pray for Colorado, it'd be a very good thing.
Yeah, it hasn't really made the news so much, so that's why I was curious about it.
Mm.
Yep.
So, and
So
thank you. Yep.
Thank you both, Erics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
You can never have enough Erics, by the way.
That's right. Should get a couple more on here. All right.
That's right.
Well, thank you guys, and have a wonderful day.
You
Yeah,
too.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
You bet.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.